lot of information that I'm going to talk about now that's kind of technical. So please take this home with you. If you have any questions, you can always email me. My email is daniel.barone@stockton.edu. I'm always available for you, questions. So don't be shy. I grew up in Holgate, so coming from a coastal community, I know the impact of sand and your concerns. So feel free to contact me. And with that said, the Coastal Research Center also aids towns directly if you have issues with beach dune issues, shoreline monitoring problems, dune erosion problems, even so far as to monitoring the lagoons and dredging problems too. Because I know a lot of cases where the dunes breached along the Barrier Island, sand went into the lagoons, you're going to have dredging issues too. Please feel free to contact us and we'd be happy to help. For the session B, we're going to get started. We're also going to hold the questions till the end because there's quite a few people online who are having trouble hearing the questions that's going on in the room. So when there's a question at the end of the session, I'll repeat it online so they can hear all the responses and see what's going on. So for session B, we're going to talk about what the risk map products are. This is the really cool stuff that you're going to actually have in a map. You can see flood depth grids, analysis grids, hazard grids, but it's going to show on a digital map. But for instance, you could actually convey this on a Google map. I don't know if you guys took the time to check out the advisory-based flood elevation maps on the Region 2 Coastal website. These products can also be shown on maps similar to that. So we're going to talk about the coastal non-regulatory products. People always talk about regulatory and non-regulatory products when it comes to risk map. I'm going to talk about that and explain exactly what that is. The public's role in the flood map revision process and the timeline. So we're going to background to risk map, overview of the data sets that's associated with risk map, the changes since the last firm. I was in a flood zone, now I'm not, or vice versa. It's actually going to show you areas where there's been special flood hazard area increases or decreases in a map, in a digital format. Flood depth and analysis grids. These are what I keep referring to, flood depth grids for, say, a 1% chance or 100-year event. It'll actually show you in a color-coded map layer how deep the water would be during a 100-year storm event in a given geographical location. There's going to be the flood risk assessment, which actually shows your risk in a color-coded area, and there's a flood report as well, and databases. So, and the other thing is the areas of mitigation interest as a data set, which actually comes from working with the town. And the towns identify areas of mitigation interest that they want to improve to lower their flood risk. So the traditional products that were associated with the National Flood Insurance Program and what FEMA provided to the towns were the DFIRM database as a result of the map modernization project. Every town gets a flood insurance study, and you get your flood insurance rate maps. What's happened recently, they've turned into digital flood insurance rate maps as a result of map modernization project. Now, when risk map came out, these are what are considered regulatory products. These are what come from FEMA doing flood insurance studies. Now, risk map provides non-regulatory flood risk products. So they're not regulated by the federal government, but they're products that are being implemented for use to convey risk to your town and to the public. So you get what's, in addition to these, you get a flood risk database, you get a flood risk report, and you get your flood risk map for your area. Now, this is done on a watershed basis. So within your entire watershed, you get a risk report for the entire watershed within your area. So there's several municipalities, in some cases, within that watershed. So there's 3 products originally. You have your flood risk database, your report, and your map. I'm sorry, there's 3 flood risk products: the database, report, and map. Now, the data sets that are a result or that feeds into the map, the report, and the database are the flood depth and analysis grids, the flood risk assessments, the changes since last firm, and the areas of mitigation interest. Now, the changes since last firm. Now, I just want to give you an idea. There's standard products, and there's also enhanced products that can come with this data set that would be provided to the town. An enhanced product would be structure and population counts impacted by the change. So what I mean by that, by the change in the flood insurance zone. So the standard is the horizontal changes in results. So those will just be polygons, taking the old boundaries with the new boundaries, merging them together and seeing what the changes are in a geographical extent. The depth and analysis grid, the standard products that come with that in the database are depths for the 10%, 4%, 2%, 1%, and 0.2% chance floods. The ones that you're probably most interested in are the 1%, which is the 100-year event. There's also a percent annual chance, because one of the things that was realized in these zones, you may be in a 100-year floodplain, but if you're closer to a river, the percentage of you getting flooded may be greater than on that boundary between the 100-year flood and the 500-year flood. So the percent annual chance actually takes all of these different percent depth grids, and it takes, okay, even though you're within the 100-year flood, you may be more prone in a certain area within the 100-year floodplain. And then it also talks about, we also create what's called the percent 30-year grid. So the average mortgage of a home is 30 years. So what this grid does is that it quantifies percent chance that you would get a flood in a 30-year period. The enhanced products for that are the water surface elevation during a different type of flood, and the elevation change grid for the 1%. So the elevation change looks at the base elevation, the water surface elevation subtracts that, so you can see how much water would actually be overland during a flooding event. And you would get velocity grids. That's an enhanced product. So you actually see the velocity of water moving across a certain area during a flooding event. And then for the data sets for the flood risk assessment, you get the average annualized loss in dollar amounts, how much loss you expect over annualized over a given year. And the refined flood risk assessment. The average annualized loss is calculated in a software called HAZAS. It's a hazard software to actually quantify damages in a geographic format. It's a very powerful tool. A lot of data from HAZAS goes into hazard mitigation plans for certain counties. And then the areas of mitigation interest. That is an enhanced product, but it's very important. So if you have a known flooding area, you want to do some type of mitigation action with that. Say you want to enhance a dam, or you want to increase, improve your stormwater management system, something like that. So changes since last firm, you want to identify areas and zones of change. So compare the current effective with the proposed flood hazard map. And then the flood zones are quantified and looked at, and then now you provide study and reach level rationale for changes. So you take the methodology and assumptions into account. Changes in model inputs or parameters, aka contributing engineering factors. So if you put in a dam up a river, it changed the way a floodplain works. And it offers stakeholders transparency and answers to, have my flood hazards increased or decreased in a certain area? Why have my flood hazards increased or decreased? And which communities are subject to these changes? So this is what the previous mapping looks like for just an example of a given area. Next slide shows the new mapping for that same area. What the changes since last firm does, it actually shows you where there's increases and decreases in the floodplain. Now, this is something that certainly interests the public, because if they're in or out of the floodplain, would have a lot of impact on whether their flood insurance changes or not through time. Now, depth and analysis grids, this is what I've been referring to, especially in the coastal zone. These are very powerful tools. What these do, they take the hydrology of the area, the terrain, the engineering aspects, the extreme cross sections, and they create stream grids across these areas to determine water surface elevation during the flooding event. So they communicate and show flood inundation as a function of an event's magnitude or severity. And they serve as key inputs to hazard risk assessment analyses. And the thing that's important is they serve as the pre-screening criteria for a mitigation project. Increase flood risk awareness as acknowledged from varied context, depth, probability, velocity. And to communicate that hazard, which is this is why we're here. the most important thing. Communicate the hazard in a mapped floodplain. So you may have a zone, a V zone. Why is it a V zone? How deep will it be? Will my house be inundated during a certain storm event? So these grids include flood depth. Standard enhanced frequencies include the 1% and then above the 500 year. Water surface elevation. The water surface elevation since last firm. A percent annual and 30% chance of flooding, the velocity, and the hill shade. These are all the grids that go into this mapping software and into the data set that would be provided to you. I just want to give you an example. The flood depth analysis grids. This is location A and location B. Location A, this is a terrain underneath here. So this is your waterway here, your floodplain. You get your 10% chance annual exceedance, or even the 1%. That elevation is approximately 53.2. B is a little lower. So this would be at about 50.3. Now, this helps to convey what the water surface elevation has to be for my house. So, same situation here, A and B. B is not in the floodplain for the 1% chance, so it's actually doing okay. Now, the 10% chance annual flood for A is in the floodplain. So it actually shows you what the water surface elevation is for that certain area in a given location. Now, the creation of these grids comes from engineering analysis. They use a lot of HECRAS and a lot of engineering looking at river flooding and things like that. It's very high technical stuff, but the important thing to know is that within a floodplain, within those zones, it shows you the depth of the water for a given area. And if a person's home, they can see what the elevation of their house is, or the first floor elevation of their home, and then they can see what the depth of the water would be in that given area. Now, all these flood depth grids go into the risk assessment process, and they're key inputs to produce the data set. And these grids will live within the flood risk database. This is another example of the 100-year storm. So this red line is the boundary of the 100-year event, and these elevations showing the depth within the 100-year floodplain. So outside it's 0 feet. Right along the line you get 0.1 feet, and in certain areas within that floodplain you get 4.7 feet. So the flooding, even though you're in a floodplain, the depth can vary significantly within a certain area. So it's important to convey that. Now this is the percent annual chance in any given year what would happen. So outside of this line is the 100-year event, or the 1%. What I was explaining before is as you get closer to that 100-year line or boundary, your percentage goes down in probability of flooding in a given area. Closer to the waterway, your percent chance of increasing to a 10% chance flood increases dramatically. So, and even outside the 100-year, say, in the 500-year floodplain, it's not a 0.2% chance within that entire area. Just outside the 100-year floodplain, you may only be 0.4% chance of occurring in a given year. Now, over a 30-year period, you quantify that times by 30, your probability of flooding in a given area increases dramatically. So you may be in the 100 and only have a 1% chance, but over a 30-year period, you now have a 26% chance of flooding within that. So these are very important things to convey to the public, that even though you're in a 1% chance and it may never happen, over a 30-year period, say the term you own a home, you have a 26% chance. That's a very large difference. And even outside that, you have an 11% chance within the 500-year floodplain. Now, flood risk assessment. Identify areas to communicate the relative flood risk based on all these grids I just showed you. So you look at the flood-prone areas, then the vulnerable people and property. And you provide the flood risk in dollar amounts. So you look at the potential damage severity for different flood frequencies, and you identify locations with possible cost-effective mitigation options. And you prove estimates for flood risk in dollars. So the losses from the average annualized loss study, and you refine the losses from the new flood study depth grids. And lastly, to refine general building stock data from local sources. So this is where HAZUS comes in. You actually import all of this information into HAZUS, and it can improve your flood risk. Because there is the HAZUS software that is created and maintained by FEMA has an out-of-the-box data that uses census data and general building stock data that's for the whole entire nation. They created this database for the entire nation, for every single town, every state, county. So there's quite a bit of data in there, but it is general data. And the census data that is in HAZUS at this point is based on the 2000 census. They're upgrading it to the 2010 at this point. So important thing is for this is if you have hazard mitigation officer or a floodplain manager who has information for general building stock, first floor elevations, anything like that, working with FEMA and someone who's maybe developing a hazard mitigation plan is critical to improving and calculating your flood risk in dollar amounts. And the flood risk assessment data, this is the HAZUS software. That's where it comes from, the average annualized loss, and refined HAZUS and other risk analysis data, and it composites it all into the flood risk assessment. This is Little Egg Harbor. Just want to give you an idea what the flood risk assessment might look like. Block A, Block B. If you look at the 100-year flood depth grid, Block A is affected by much deeper water. So the actual, total damage from a 100-year event for that block, the census block here, is about $1.7 million in that one area. Block B, in a map here, is $211,000. And it can actually generate the amount of debris within that block, how much will be generated in that 1% chance flood. So Block A would produce 77.6 tons of debris. And Block B would be 12.2 tons. And all of these data are coming out of HAZUS. All this information is based on the building information that's already in the database in HAZUS. And it goes all into the flood risk assessment. So you can see why these depth grids are extremely important, because they can actually, you can encroach in using those depth grids into a floodplain, see what structure is going to be impacted, and how much, what the cost would be. And then finally, areas of mitigation interest. You identify areas and communities with relative flood risk. You raise awareness by local stakeholders, and you provide input for local mitigation plans. Now, items that may have an impact, positive or negative, on the identified flood hazard or flood risk. That's what the areas of mitigation are. And some examples might be riverine and coastal flood structures, dams, levees, coastal berms, seawalls, groin, engineered beaches and dunes, at-risk essential facilities. So if you have a hospital that's in a floodplain, you may want to do some type of mitigation action. So if it's an essential facility or a school or a shelter, something like that within the town, you want to identify that. And all these are identified by doing local meetings and working with the towns to identify the areas for identifying risks with certain structures. Just as also land use changes and hot spots, clusters of claims, repetitive lost properties, things like that. And locations of successful mitigation projects, things that you've already done to improve your town to reduce your flood risk. This is an example of what the areas of mitigation interest look like. Literally just points on a map that show you all the different things that have been done in this particular area. Accredited levees, non-accredited levees, dams, coastal structures, areas of significant riverine or coastal flooding, other flood risk areas. So there's quite a bit of different places. And this is what the map looks like for the areas of mitigation interest. So you could have 3 or 4 on a map, and you can actually locate where they are as points, and you can have pictures of what you're talking about, have a little description. And all of this is in a GIS data set, so all this information you can just pull up on a map, and you can convey this information for hazard mitigation plans for this data set. And Also, this emergency route is often covered by floodwater during 100 years. So this is just a zoom in of what an area mitigation interest looks like. So you might want to, okay, what are we going to do here to reduce the flood risk? Because that looks like it's a problem. Since last firm, you may want to, this is something that's to use for the areas of mitigation interest, because if you're looking at changes since last firm, there's been a decrease in the floodplain or an increase in certain areas, then that may help you decide what you want to mitigate now, especially with certain structures. You may want to mandate that certain structures be raised or improve bulkheading, things like that. Dam, you need analysis from dam safety features. The locations of dams are extremely important because depending on what types of dams, if they're accredited, non-accredited, or if they're older, they're significant enough to affect your floodplain. Because if they fail during a certain event, your floodplain may increase dramatically. So having these is flexible depending on varying state regulation methods, but the enhanced data sets include, for the dam actual feature, is the dam characteristics, upstream inundation areas that are delineated, downstream inundation areas are delineated, sort of depth and analysis grid associated with those, easements and critical facilities for the dams, flood risk assessments, and additional areas of mitigation interest. Now, these are the maps looking at certain dams along for the Norton Lake Dam. This is just an example from FEMA showing the flood risk map based on that dam, as well as looking at coastal risk for a specific area. These are examples that FEMA put together in a map. So what the maps are showing is they're color-coded based high, medium, low risk, and they actually show areas of mitigation interest, and it also shows the different types of features that are going into your flood risk map. And this ultimately will go in your flood risk report as well. So the risk map products, the non-regulatory things, again, are the flood risk database, the report, and the maps. And this is the flood risk map for a given watershed. So your municipality may be within that watershed, and the report is also going with that. The database itself, the flood depth grid, since last firm, the areas of mitigation interest, all of this are intended to be used in a geographic format. So if you have a GIS person within your town, all of these data can be displayed in a GIS-friendly format, which can then be actually put online in a web map, like Google Maps or something like that, which is extremely valuable. I can't say enough how important it is to convey these maps to the public in a meaningful way, because once they can see geographically where they are in the world and the risk that's associated with that, then they'll start to understand why perhaps they were in a flood zone and now they're not, or vice versa. So the real usefulness of this data set is when it's combined with local data, housing data, commercial data, infrastructure, things like that, because then you can actually put dollar amounts to your flood risk in HAZARD software. So this supports risk analysis and hazard mitigation planning, and it does require GIS capabilities to understand and apply the data to local questions and problems, but with this data, you can reach answers to some of those problems. So the flood risk report, the background of this, the pieces that go into a flood risk report based on all this data that comes out of risk map, all these products. The purpose of the flood risk report and the assessment, the methods involved, risk reduction practices. And then also it talks about project results, the changes since last firm, depth analysis grid. It basically summarizes all the data sets within your, based on the flood risk study. So this is what the actual report looks like from risk map. It's a template that's provided to you based on the data that's provided to you as well. So you can actually create these yourself based on the template and all the data. And then the maps, the flood risk map, it's intended to provide geographic summary of the risks with the project area within your watershed. It's not a regulatory product. So the regulatory products are still the digital flood insurance rate maps. The flood risk map is a supplemental map to convey that risk. I know I keep repeating that, but it's very important because if people aren't understanding their risk, then they're just going to be concerned about why they're in the floodplain or why they're not. What's included in here in the legend has the flood data, the rivers and streams, and the risk. It actually puts all the depth grids and wave velocity and all these things into risk. It actually quantifies them all in color-coded areas. So it says if you're a high risk in a certain area, low risk. So it doesn't actually have the floodplain in there per se. It has your risk involved. And then it has the areas of mitigation interest. And all this is standard that comes with risk maps. So it's out of the box. This is what you get with the data. There's a little zoom in here. It shows you the risk. So these areas are actually showing you high, medium, low risk, and an area of mitigation. If you have a high risk in this certain area, you can say, okay, we want to do some stream flow construction, do some more stormwater management in a certain area. Yeah. Will the flood risk products be available through the MAP Service Center or somewhere else? It will be uploaded to the RAG. Okay. All of the inundation maps. I'm sorry. Everything will be uploaded to the RAMP website and the Region 2 Coastal website if you're interested in downloading that. For sake of time, I'm just going to keep on going. We can revisit these questions at the end. I'm sorry, I'm just getting a lot of questions online. We're going to try to address these at the end. But these are the coastal products, so I'm sure there's a lot that you guys are very interested in. The coastal products associated with risk map are very, very cool because they convey information about the coastal hazard, and they enhance the risk awareness. Because as you know, as I said before, a lot of people that live at the shore now were out there 20 years ago. They don't know the risk, or they do now after Sandy. And these will supplement all of that information, so they'll have a better understanding of what could happen. So this will encourage action at the community level. So having your public actually come to meetings and seeing the data themselves on a map to show them what can happen during a given event, and ultimately just reduce risk. So the base products for the coastal areas are changing since the last firm, the coastal 1% annual chance, which includes velocity, things like that, the depth grids, the average annualized loss in dollar amounts, as I said before. And the coastal specific products would be inundation, waves, and erosion. I know someone had a question about erosion previously, and they can be developed for an entire study coastline or for focused areas of the municipality. This is what a depth grid looks like within a barrier island community. Here, I don't know if you can see here. And then one of the coastal products that's been added to that is areas affected by increased inundation. So they did a hypothetical 1, 2, 3 foot increase on top of that to see which areas would be affected if you had 1 to 3 feet of increased elevation on a grid on a specific area. So the red area is the base flood elevation plus 3 feet. So you can see it expands all the way into this area. So if you have a storm surge that's, God forbid, higher than the 1% flood, then this will give you a good idea of which areas would inundate first. So it provides results from the coastal analysis. So the overland wave modeling, the storm surge analysis, everything that we've been talking about, I'm sure I bored you with, gave you, all of this information comes from that. So the flood depth grids, the flood depth grids based on hypothetical 1 foot increases, the wave height grid, and the primary frontal dune data sets. I'm sure the people from La Valette are interested in this because this is a really good information for conveying whether a dune will erode or not during a 100-year event. And I'm sure you're aware that dune systems and beaches are highly dynamic, but these give a really good idea of your risk if you live along the beachfront. So the wave height grid, so this can actually take, in those V zones, what the wave height would be within a given area. So obviously along the beachfront, the wave heights are much higher, and as you move closer to the bay, they get much lower. But even along the bay, they're still higher until you get inland. I'm sure, as you've seen from the advisory-based flood elevations, a lot of the V zones have been extended along the bay shores. The wave height severity analysis. This represents the relative wave hazard impact. So even if you're not in a V zone, you could still be impacted by waves. So what this is saying, within this area, the highest risk, within this area, you have moderate risk of being impacted by waves. Now, keep in mind, previous to this, there was none of this information was available to the public or to the town. It was just the map, V zone, A zone. So you can say, one of your people in your town can come to you, I live at this address here, what's my risk for being inundated? And you can actually show these maps, and they can see it for themselves in a meaningful way. The erosion risk, one of the things that FEMA has done has been using the overland wave modeling to see if a dune will be completely eroded or removed during a given event or just significantly eroded. And what these convey, you can see right here. So in the red shows that the dune is completely removed, and in the yellow it means there's dune retreat, so it's not completely eroded. So this is extremely important because if you're an oceanfront homeowner, you want to know if your dune's going to breach during a 100-year event. I'm sure a lot of people found that out, but it's another extremely useful tool. And just to supplement this, the Coastal Research Center is doing something similar to this, looking at higher resolution areas, lot and block level, to convey risk for beaches and dunes for given storm events. We've been looking at this between the 2 and the 100-year event, trying to model dune erosion. So if any local people are interested in looking at that data, we can provide that to you as well. And then the coastal products come out with a risk assessment. It combines all the wave height analysis, the depth grids, the coastal erosion, and it can tell you what your risk is within a certain area. And this is another product that's going to be available to you in a GIS format. So it's extremely, extremely valuable. And then all the information comes out of that and goes in the flood risk report. All those data sets go into tables, and it can get degenerated into the flood risk report. That's that template that comes with all of this. So prior to this, there was nothing. I mean, you got your flood insurance rate maps and your flood insurance study, and then that was it. Now you have this entire report that you have as a reference to say, okay, this is our high flood risk area. What are we going to do to mitigate certain activities in here? Are there any questions regarding the non-regulatory products, just before I move on?
So there, my question is the depth grid.
Yes.
And the base flood elevation.
Depth grid, base flood elevation.
So how are they, if you use the depth grid and you get the elevation of water, how is that related to a base flood elevation number?
Okay. So a depth grid related to a base flood elevation on a map. Well, the depth grid, the extent of the depth grid is within, let's say you're looking at the 1% chance annual flood, the extent of that grid is within the 100-year floodplain. In a lot of cases, it's across an entire barrier island. So even though an area floods within that, the magnitude of flooding varies geographically. So if you may just be in a zone and the base flood may change by a few feet, but the actual water depth is different than the base flood. Am I correct? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When you say depth of 4 feet, from the ground to the
I guess I'm just wondering if you indicate that. If you're the maximum with the base flood elevation is 10 feet, but the depth of the water is maybe 4 feet.
Well, they're 100 years, and you're going to have 4 feet.
Should be the
Yeah.
Inundation maps can be generally available.
yeah. They're standard products. So, yeah. Sorry, I think I was getting a little confused for your question. Yeah.
Model data itself be available as well as the database, the actual model will be available?
As far as I know, they will not. It's just the products. So the depth grids, the areas of mitigation, it's just changes since last burn. The actual modeling data, as far as I know, is going to be a part of the database. Yeah. 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 The actual base itself contains all that information will be provided to you. The modeling data, Joe said, you'd have to get elsewhere. Yes.
The risk product, will they be based on pre-Sandy information or post-Sandy?
Pre-Sandy, because the modeling that has already been done is not accounting for Hurricane Sandy, because a lot of it had been done already. Question?
Is it indicated that the wave action will be impacted by the structure? We also said that the information is not included, but a lot of structures are removed in the middle. Won't that then change the model?
A lot of them or.
Yeah. Right. You're not wrong, but at the same time, remodeling an entire state following that would be extremely difficult and time-consuming. Well, if that's the case, then you would have to go for a letter.
Any erosion risk will identify what date that the base condition is you're eroding.
Repeat the question?
In other words, since the erosion analysis was done based upon a given condition at a certain date.
Correct.
And then it's giving the results of that analysis. Those results will include what that date was.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
One question here. Are the depth grids using the swell, or are they considering wave run-up in the V zone?
Yeah. Yeah, they're including wave run-up and overcalls, wave modeling as well, because it's a coastal zone. So yeah. So what's the community action? Just to wrap this up, you want to communicate the risk, obviously. Personal actions, know your risk, know your role, and take action. It's kind of the saying for risk map, what we're trying to convey. And review and comment on preliminary maps, the flood insurance study report. That's going to be imperative because once these maps are adopted, they're adopted. And you want to support implementation of community mitigation plans. Community mitigation plans are extremely important, especially if you're in CRS, things like that. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'll really comment.
The preliminary firms, you should be provided the preliminary firms. Yeah. 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 So every community will. Yeah.
And at that point, will they have determined the actuarial values and how big it will be through with flood insurance?
Well, I'm not a flood insurance expert, but once those maps are out, if they're not adopted, then the insurance companies, I don't think, can do the actual rates until the maps are actually adopted.
So we don't really know the impact financially at the time we're doing the maps.
As far as I know. What are some of the actions that are presently underway in your community after Sandy? Celia. Following Sandy, are you guys trying to push for the beach dune replenishment projects? Are you doing anything to shore up your dunes, clear out stormwater? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The beach replenishment has been ongoing for years.
Yeah.
Some communities, it did wait for the people who are assigned,
Mm-hmm.
and some that is a challenge.
Still 4 holdouts in Holgate.
But
farther now.
Certainly, it's become more aggressive.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Traffic going in, this big sign saying, I'm the ship out.
Yep.
So there's pressure.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
Now, do you think conveying the risk to some of these people in this format would change their minds at this point? Or do you think if Sandy didn't do it, then it's just not happening?
Some have, you're familiar with the things.
Yeah. I just read that.
We are conveying the risk, we have been.
Okay.
Sandy conveyed it better.
Yeah. That's unfortunate, too,
It is.
because now it's reactive.
A lot of that big block flooding can happen.
Yep.
Bad, like, flooding.
Well, Ship Bottom has had more substantial dunes than a lot of the other towns on the island had. But the dune breaching was not as significant.
Because this is the township,
Mm-hmm.
replenishment is on the 31st.
Yep.
Last summer, and we wrote that day after the storm, as soon as the water was down,
Mhm.
you didn't see much sand on the side
Yep.
streets, but here at 59th Street, and
Yeah.
they were fine.
Yep. Well, one of the things, just as a side note, that we've noticed, especially along the oceanfront communities, was the dune access waves. If they're lower than the dune crest elevation, that just creates an avenue for waves and water to erode the dune. So the way the Army Corps has been designing these projects is they actually build the access ways on top of the dune crest. So you have to walk over the dune as opposed to cutting through it. The problem gets even worse when you have a jetty or a groin in front of the access way, because it focuses the wave energy right at the access way at the street end. So one of the things to mitigate that was to raise those access way elevations too, in terms of shoring up your dunes.
We need to at least rely on that, because I know most of them are chippy.
Yes. So we're just going to talk about the timelines really quick, and then we're going to wrap it up. For the advisory-based flood elevation maps, coastal studies, and the flood map revision. Well, the ABFEs are already out for the state, as you know, and the governor already has adopted those. Oh, it's not showing up. Okay. Well, the important thing to know for here, because for some reason the slide isn't showing up online, for Ocean County, for the preliminary maps, look for August. Atlantic, September. Cape May, you're going to look at you're looking at October for the preliminary maps. Monmouth, looking at July. Anyone else? Yeah.
How accurate is timeline? I've heard that it's not actually going to meet.
As far as, from what I'm being told, it's September. They did have some issues with data collection and some of the baseline data sets originally, so they did have to push the dates back a bit. Everything should be coming out as scheduled, as far as we know. So. Yes.
The APFPs that were adopted by the governor on Friday, would that mean that any plans I approved today, tomorrow, in the D zone, that were DEP permitted, even if they decide to meet the correct standards?
General permit or permit by rule,
So the question is, let's turn on the mic. All right. Is there any more questions?
What if the municipality is the same, then do we still have to go to the DEP? And yeah, people always have to get, unless, like I said, they're just going up and it's just permit by rule. It's just as long as they go to the regulations or above.
So if it's, if it's covered by the Zane Act, for example, we're same footprint, we're good.
Mm-hmm.
Does it have any effect on the Zane Act, the new,
The emergency rule?
yeah, with the Zane Act was passed 20 years ago that if you were in the same footprint.
You talk about like bathroom?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the same thing.
But if you go from a B to an A, and the ABFEs are there, and the BFEs are here, and that starts the regulatory process, it's 2 years later, you go from a B to an A. Does the town allow that guy to rebuild to an A standard, knowing that you went from a B to an A and it's gonna take 2 years to get through the regulatory process? Or do we just say, you can't do anything with that home, you're substantially damaged, you're in a B, even though, you know, you're an A now in the preliminary, so we have to wait for 2 years for him to rebuild?
You're talking about ones with preliminary?
Well, the house
Just the preliminaries, right, the ones in August, the Barone County, August, and then September. So once the BFE comes out, okay, that then starts the regulatory process of 18 months, public comment,
Right.
hearings, all that other stuff. If somebody goes from a B to an A, and the town allows them to rebuild on the based on the BFE,
I wouldn't recommend that.
You
If the
wouldn't?
house was destroyed,
well, yeah, if he's from a B to an A, and he wants to rebuild as an A,
Right.
just put a foundation up, or substantially damaged, not even,
right?
you know, maybe too technical question, somebody's gonna say,
Right.
people can't wait to do
Yeah.
it.
By the time the preliminary map comes out,
Right.
the APFE map may go away.
Yeah.
It's not even
Right,
preliminary.
right, but if you went from a B to the old map.
Oh, the old map.
On
In the old map.
ABS.
So it's a lesser,
Yeah.
BFE.
lesser strict requirement.
So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but communities can regulate
Mm-hmm.
using the preliminary map, preliminary forms.
Okay, and that will the state adopting, they're gonna have to adopt it, no?
But doesn't the NFIP require them to be at least as strict as the existing or stricter?
What of the ABFT, the communities going to adopt?
No, but I'm saying that the existing, the effective map. Now,
The issue of ABFT versus.
I'm talking about the effective, what if less than the effective map? Then you might have an issue if it's less restrictive than the effective map. Yeah, your minimum standard is the effective.
So the effective map right now is.
That's the minimum standard.
That's the ABFE,
No,
and then.
no, the ABFE isn't the effective map. The effective map is the effective, or the existing map. The ABFE.
I'll talk to you offline.
Yeah.
Yeah, one other question. You mentioned that there were, that someone was looking at, or perhaps, alternate methods of construction in the rezone.
Mm-hmm.
Who?
Alternate methods of
Yes,
construction in
we're
the
talking
region.
about rebuilding or trying to update
For existing structure.
existing structure.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in the rezone. I mean, that's now in the rezone. Because there is, I thought I heard.
Okay. As far as I know, depending on the foundation, you can raise the home in place, but that depends on the foundation. Driving pilings is, you need to move the house, as far as I know, yeah.
Well, has any, I mean, is there any study?
If there's just helical piles.
Helical piles.
Yeah.
You can put in helical piles where you don't have to, you just lift the structure and then you put them in.
You have to then form
Yeah.
your concrete.
Right.
Mhm.
So you're looking at doubling the price, like
Yeah.
200,000 to raise it out.
No, it's not.
I've just, do you want any other technique?
No, it's the other way.
Okay. That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, that was probably.
If there are no more questions, we can wrap it up. I think we're right on time. Thank you very much for coming. We'll be sending out all the materials.
Good job.
Thanks.
Thank you for up and helping.
What? Karen. Right.